Alright, the procedure video for the air content by pressure method I think covers this test really well. So I just wanted to go over a few of the little details that might show up on the written test, as well as some of the verbal questions you'll have to answer while performing the practical test. So just a quick reminder again about the timeline that we're on, because these questions will definitely show up in the exams. You've got your 15 minutes to collect your composite sample. You get to your test site, and then you remix your sample. And then at that 0 minute, when time begins, you have your first 5 minutes where you have to measure your temperature, perform the slump test, and remember the slump test must be done within 2.5 minutes from start to finish. And then also within that first 5 minutes, you have to begin your air test. And this is the other option you have for the air test. There's three options. You can perform the pressure method, which is by far the most common. You can calculate air content using a density measurement, which is the same pot as you use for your air pressure test. And then you could also use this new device, which is called the rollometer. So this is the exact set that we have. We have two of these sets. It's a plastic. It's the lightest weight, so it's a little easier to do the shaking over your head procedure. But the clamping system isn't great, so we'll get into that when we actually perform the test. Because there's no mechanical parts, there's no gauges, there's no sensors, this device requires no annual calibration. And this test is suitable for all aggregates. That will be a question on the written test. Recall last week the pressure test could not be done if you had lightweight or porous aggregates, because the pressure would basically read the air content within those porous aggregates and give you a false high air content reading. So when you have those specific types of aggregates, this is the test that you must use. Here in Montana, we don't have lightweight rocks. We've got really good granite, so it's unlikely that you'll ever have to perform this test other than once every 5 years just to become ACI certified. I guess I have heard that if you're doing work on highways on the reservations in Montana, those agencies will require this test over the air pressure method. I don't know if that's still true or not. And I think I've heard that transportation departments in Wyoming require this test to frequently or infrequently check the results coming from the air pot as well. Unlike all of the other tests we've talked about, this pot, because it's so much smaller, right, it's just this big right here, we only fill this in 2 lifts. Each lift is still going to be rodded 25 times, and you're going to be asked what's the shape of that rod, and you can see down here it has hemispherical or rounded tips. And the only other requirement with this test is that you can use the long rods that you're also using for slump, or you can use a shorter rod so long as it's at least 4 inches taller than the height of this small pot. And another step that people kind of forget to do is that once you've filled up your pot in those lifts, you've striked it or cleaned it off using your strike bar, you really want to clean that surface. You saw that in the video. He really took time to take a sponge in his fingers and clean off that lip, because you want to make a good seal between the pot and the gasket on this upper chamber. And then when you've got that sealed, before you start adding in your initial liquids, your water, you want to put that funnel in. And that funnel's purpose is to disperse the water so that it doesn't splash and create any kind of entrapped air pockets in your concrete sample that you took time to prepare. So I see that a lot. People will forget to put that funnel down in the neck before they start adding their water. So make sure you remember to do that. So that's this step right here. When you start adding in your liquids, because what we've got now is we've got a pot here full of concrete, and now we need to fill up this entire upper chamber with water, all the way up here to the 0 line on your scale, and that's right over here. That's your calibration line. So your first step is you add 1 pint of water, at least 1 pint of water, and then you add your alcohol. And this will also be a question, both a verbal question during the performance test and probably a question on the written test, is how much alcohol do you add? The correct answer is you add whatever the manufacturer says you should for this particular concrete. Typically you're going to see people add a full pint of alcohol. The type of alcohol, that'll be another question. It's isopropyl alcohol, 70%. Not the strong 90% that you can get at the drugstores as well. It's just your typical 70% isopropyl alcohol. So after you've added your minimum pint of water, put in your required amount of alcohol, now you're just going to start dumping water in here all the way until it fills up to this 0 line. And in the video, he talks about you use the meniscus, right? So water is going to adhere to the sides of this neck, and it's going to get pulled up on the sides, and it's going to form this kind of he calls it a smiley face shape, right? So the bottom of that smiley face is the meniscus, and that's the water level that you want to be right at 0 here. Your first step, you saw this in the video, is to pick this thing up, invert it, and shake it for 45 seconds, inverting it no more than 5 seconds at a time. And you only do this step this very first time. You don't have to perform this step a second time, and that's something that trips people up. They'll want to do this on their second round as well, but you only invert it once. We're not going to make you do it 45 seconds in the actual practical tests. We'll make you do it for maybe 5 seconds, and then we'll ask you, how long do you do this for? After you've inverted it, you then go to the rolling procedure, and this is the meat and bones of this test. It's why it's called the rollometer, because you have to incline this apparatus at about 45 degrees, grab it by whatever you can grab it by, and then just start shearing it really sharply to try and loosen up this concrete down here. You do that for a full 60 seconds, and you do this every step. So that's the only step that you'll be repeating. You don't repeat the inverting. So after you've rolled it for your 60 seconds, then you're going to set it down, you're going to pop this cap off, and you're going to burp it. And you're going to let kind of that air out, that whatever air you released from the concrete here, you're going to let that out. And then you're going to wait minimum 2 minutes up to 6 minutes for that water level to stabilize. So you're going to watch the water level here in your neck. It started up here at 0 before you did all that agitation. Now it's going to be down here somewhere. If that water level doesn't stabilize within 6 minutes, the test is invalid, you start over, and you add more alcohol. That's going to be the answer to a lot of these if or if then questions. Is test is invalid, start over, add more alcohol. So that's the first reason why you would have to start over, is that the water level did not stabilize after 6 minutes. If you see more than 2% foam in the neck at this stage, you also have to start over and add more alcohol, right? So what we mean by that is these divisions here represent percent by volume of this initial pot. So if your water level is down here at 4, your meniscus level, and you've got a bunch of foam on top all the way up here to number 1, that's 3 percentage points of foam. That's too much foam for this test to be valid. So you only want to have maximum 2 percentage points of foam on top of your water. We probably won't see that because we're using Saccrete. that doesn't generate a whole lot of foam. And the third thing to look for here is if you don't see any water in your neck, that would mean you've got greater than 9% air content. So if your water started up here at 0, and then after shaking and releasing the air from the pot, your water level is below below the scale where you can read it, it means you've got over 9%. Or it means you have a leak in your system. And if you have a leak, you obviously have to start over as well. But we're going to assume everything's tight, your gaskets are good. You just have a lot of air. If that's the case, and he doesn't talk about this much in the video, you have to add more water back into this so you can bring the water level up into a portion of your scale that you can read. And you do that with this little cup down here, right? And this cup represents 1% of the volume of this pot. And that's a question on the homework here this week. It's a question that'll probably show up on the written portion of this test. Is what's the volume of the cup used to add water during the test, and it's 1%. So you count how many little 1% cups of water you've added into your neck. So maybe you've added 5, and if by adding 5 little cups, that brings the water level up to the number 6, your air content would be, right, 6% that you're reading plus the 5% that you had to occupy with water. So your air content would actually be 11% if you had to add 5 little cups of water to bring it up to the 6 line. Doesn't matter how many cups you add, you just have to know how many so you can keep track and count. Okay, whatever you read along your scale here, that's called your initial reading. And when you have your initial air content reading, you're going to cap this neck and you're going to perform the rolling procedure a second time. So don't pick it up and invert it over your head, right? You don't do that more than once. You're going to do the rolling procedure again a second time. So you invert it 45 degrees, right? Grab it by the handle as best you can and start rolling it and shearing it. Turning it every 5 seconds. You're going to do that for a full 60 seconds. And then you're going to go through this process again. Right? You're going to unplug it, and you're going to burp it, and you're going to check for those exact same things. Watch to see if it's going to stabilize within minimum 2 minutes, no more than 6 minutes. If it doesn't, what do? Right? This is that standard answer. Start over, add more alcohol. Check your foam. Make sure you don't have more than 2% foam. If you have more than 2% foam, you start over and you add more alcohol. And then here's the next if-then question is you're going to get a new reading for air content, and it should not go up, right? You can't be losing air. I'm sorry, you can't be right. You can't be losing negative air, I should say, from your pot. If anything, rolling it that second time released more of that entrained air down here. So you should be seeing your water level only going down. If that second reading differs from your initial reading by more than 1/4%, right, you're not doing enough, you're not rolling it well enough. So if that's the case, if you're more than 1/4% different from your initial reading, you got to cap it and roll it a third time. 60 seconds again. You're going to burp it, watch it to stabilize, look at your foam. And now if that third reading is more than 1/4% different from your second reading, you have an invalid test, you start over, and you add more alcohol. But if those subsequent readings are within 1/4% of your prior reading, you have a valid test. So 1/4% is one of these little divisions over here. So that's 1/4% air content. And if you recall, last week we talked about the air pressure pot being a more precise tool because that gauge reads air content to the nearest 1/10%. This tool is only reading it to the nearest 1/4%. And then the last step, like you saw in the video, is you pour out your contents, you disassemble your device, and you dump out the concrete from your pot. And you want to examine, right? You want to examine the bottom of the pot for undisturbed cement paste. And if you have an excessive amount of undisturbed cement paste still stuck in the bottom of this pot, it means you didn't roll it sharply enough during the rolling procedure. So that would be the last reason that this test would be invalid and that you would have to start over.